Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this NSA webinar titled School-Based Law Enforcement. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our website. We will have time for questions today at the end of the webinar, but please keep yourself muted at all times and use the chat box to submit your questions. Next slide, please. Please remember to keep yourself muted at all times. Today's webinar is supported by the COPS Office through our Cooperative Agreement for School Safety and Security. Thank you to the COPS Office for your support. Next slide, please. Before I introduce you to our facilitator today, I'll give you a quick overview of NSA. Chartered in 1940, NSA is a professional association dedicated to serving the Office of Sheriff and its affiliates through education, training, and general law enforcement resources. NSA provides these resources and advocacy for sheriffs, law enforcement, criminal justice professionals, and their communities. There are currently over 3,000 sheriffs nationwide. Our membership base includes over 13,000 individual members, including sheriffs, deputies, other law enforcement officers, public safety professionals, and concerned citizens. Next slide, please. Our facilitator today is Jeff Allison. Jeff began his law enforcement career as a trooper with the Maryland State Police and then served as a field training officer and juvenile detective with the Aurora, Colorado Police Department. He then moved back to Washington and completed a 30-year career with the U.S. Department of Justice, with the last 11 years serving as a special advisor for school and campus public safety at FBI headquarters. Jeff now staffs and serves as a chairperson for the COPS Office School Safety Working Group. In that capacity, Jeff helped author the 10 Essential Actions report, which is the basis for today's webinar. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Christy, and thanks everyone for joining us. The topic of school-based law enforcement is certainly timely as our students and school resource officers and deputies return to learn in person. And of course, this is happening as communities across America are considering how best to provide public safety services. We know that in many cases, these examinations include the role of school-based law enforcement. But in order to have a truly informed discussion, we first need to know what a well-run school resource officer program looks like. And that will be the main theme of today's webinar. Next slide, please. Take just a second and check out our learning objectives. All of these objectives taken together, constitute the key ingredients for a well-run school resource officer program. And we are fortunate to have with us the preeminent subject matter expert on school-based law enforcement and public safety in America. Next slide, please. Mo Canady became the executive director of the National Association of School Resource Officers in 2011 after serving for 25 years with the Hoover, Alabama Police Department, where he retired as a lieutenant. Mo's last 12 years with Hoover PD were spent as a supervisor of the School Services Division. NASRO's growth under Mo's leadership has been remarkable, and he's the go-to subject matter expert for major media outlets when anything significant happens in the world of school safety. Mo has testified before Congress, state legislatures, and the Federal Commission on School Safety, which convened following the Parkland school shooting. He's a trusted partner for federal agencies with a mission in school safety. And on a personal note, that's how I got to know Mo and become involved with his work, with NASRO's work when I was still at the FBI. And it's been an incredible partnership, I know, for federal law enforcement in particular. So Mo, setting the stage for today's discussion, again, we know that the communities across the country are taking a fresh look at school-based law enforcement. Right here in Maryland, in Prince George's County, Maryland, the school board recently released the findings from a survey they conducted with their community members, which included staff, faculty, parents, and students. They got 13,000 responses back, and 82% of them indicated that SROs are important or very important to maintaining a safe teaching and learning environment. I know that what you want to share with us today, is the key ingredients for maintaining those levels of confidence. So Mo, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. And if we could go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And Jeff, I really do appreciate that very kind introduction. I've come away from it thinking I'm not sure that I'm worthy. I do want to apologize to everyone right out of the gate here that I'm wearing nothing that's green in celebration of St. Patrick's Day today, but I do have this hat next to me. So I just wanted to let you know I've got a little green nearby, but I hope you're having a great St. Patrick's Day and looking forward just to spending a few minutes with you. And again, Jeff really hit the nail on the head on some things. And I think that Prince George's County survey is really critically important for us to pay attention to. I firmly believe, in the work that we've done, that communities by and large support good SRO programs in their school community. And we'll talk about what that means. What does a good SRO program look like? It's not just throwing police or sheriff's deputies at a problem. It's very much calculated in how we do this, and very much about community-based policing. So we'll kind of dive into that a little bit. And I've already found myself trying to forward my own slides. So next slide, please. Thank you. I want to let you know our office is located in Hoover, Alabama. I'm currently in Virginia at the moment, visiting my son who's in the United States Navy. But if you're from the deep South, thoughts and prayers with you this afternoon and evening, as we're facing a significant weather event in that area. So if you're from that area, you're probably already busy working on staying safe tonight. But our office is located in the Hoover Public Safety Center, just south of Birmingham, Alabama. And we're very thankful to the city of Hoover with our partnership with that wonderful city and the office space that they provide for our 12 employees, 12 staff members. So it's a wonderful place to be able to work. And we're slowly but surely beginning to get a person or two actually back in the office.
It wasn't a matter of finding it. It was a matter of jumping through a bunch of hoops. Yeah. Okay.
We got a muting issue there. All right, looks like we got that solved. All right, next slide, please. I just always share the slide, and this is me from another lifetime ago, trying to do a Tom Selleck impersonation, a very bad one, from the late 80s. I was a fairly new officer, and this was one of the first children that I got to know. This was actually the daughter of some of our best friends, and I was newly married. My wife and I had already decided we're not going to have kids. And but all of a sudden, we just wound up really engaging with the two young daughters of these friends of ours, and learned a lot about children and from these wonderful children. This young lady is now a grown adult, of course, and a fantastic attorney and pretty good author in the Atlanta area. And she sent this to me just a few years ago, just as kind of a reminder. And so this really was as a law enforcement officer, really the first engagement I had with children. And so I appreciate Danielle sharing that with me. Next slide, please. So I don't know about you, but I'm ready for some in-person training. I'm really thankful to be here today. Christy, thank you so much, you and Chelsea, for getting this set up. And I really do appreciate this opportunity. But if you're like me, you're ready to get back to some in-person training, and we're looking forward to renewing our in-person national conference this summer in Orlando, Florida, at the beautiful Rose and Shingle Creek Resort. And love to have you join us there for our 31st annual National School Safety Conference, finally back in person again. Next slide, please. NASRO, one of the things that we do along with membership services is we publish actually the Journal of School Safety every quarter. We've been doing this for 14 years now. Hard to believe that we've hit our 14th anniversary on this particular publication. It's an award-winning journal, and one of the membership benefits that we provide both in print and digital. Next, please. We provide a number of training opportunities across the country as well as internationally. The international work slowed down this past year, but we're looking to renew that this coming year, and looking forward to spending time again in person with folks. We did temporarily convert this to a virtual live version, but we're back to doing some live trainings and really excited as we continue to explore how to safely do that. Next slide, please. Just some of the training courses we offer. We'll talk a little about the basic course today, but I do want to draw your attention to the fourth bullet point, which is our adolescent mental health training. And this is specifically geared for school resource officers and educators. And it's been a very successful 1.5-day workshop across the country. And we're continuing to provide this workshop, and updates to this material are going on actually as we speak. So we're really excited about that. Next slide. NASRO, just a few years ago, published a set of standards and best practices for school resource officer programs. And just like everything else, we're constantly taking a look at these best practice recommendations and looking at what the updates need to be. And there's actually an update occurring right now. And the committee is scheduled to meet to finalize those updates at the end of next month. So very important that we approach this school-based policing work with a good set of standards and best practices. Next slide, please. So when we think about a school resource officer, an SRO, I sometimes think that we find ourselves forgetting what an SRO actually is supposed to be. I share with you here the federal definition, and I won't bore you by reading it, but I will point out 3 really important points in it. And first is that SROs are sworn certified law enforcement officers. I sometimes see or hear of individuals referring to themselves as SROs when they don't actually meet that first qualifying point, that they're a sworn certified law enforcement officer. So it's really important that we get our hands around that fact. Secondly, this is a community-based policing approach. As I mentioned in the opening, we can't just throw law enforcement at a problem at a school. We've got to take a community-based policing approach, with the first goal being relationship building. And all good law enforcement officers know that you get so much more information, important information, through good relationships than you do in just about any other way. So these relationships on school campuses are no different. And then finally, there has to be good collaboration between the school district and law enforcement agency. Critical that these 2 entities are shoulder to shoulder on how this works. Next slide, please. Bridging the gap. The number 1 goal of an SRO should be to bridge the gap. It's what we teach in day 1 of our basic course, that the relationships between law enforcement and students are critical. So building good, positive relationships with students is a big part of bridging the gap. Next slide. What are some goals of an SRO program? Go ahead to the next slide, please. First of all, I just mentioned to bridge the gap between law enforcement officers and young people, but also we want to increase positive attitudes towards law enforcement. A very important approach for SROs to take is the idea that, you know, we're being face-to-face every day, really, with the future public safety professionals in our communities. These are our next generation of law enforcement officers, of firefighters, of medics, you name it. And so we really need to be, as SROs, we need to be about the business of increasing those positive attitudes towards law enforcement. Next, please. So we know that an SRO is a sworn certified law enforcement officer. Next. But they must be carefully and properly selected. And I could speak on this for the entire length of this session and continue on for another 40 minutes. This is critical. If you are a supervisor listening in today, a sheriff, a chief, all the way down to a corporal that has a responsibility of selection in this particular arena, take this seriously. It may be the most important thing you do. This is the most unique assignment in law enforcement. There is just nothing else like it. So we got to make sure that we are selecting the right people to put in this environment with students every day. Next, please. And then they must be specifically trained. They must be specifically trained in how to do this job. There is a right and wrong way to do it. Next, please. So we certainly want to look for individuals who can be positive role models, all the way from good moral standards, all the way down to sincere concern for the school and community. We want to make sure again, that we're getting the right person. Next slide. So one of the things that we want to make sure is that we're selecting people who can be a good teammate. So as an SRO, be a good teammate. This is not something, a job that or an assignment that we want to do in a vacuum or in a silo. We want to make sure that we are connecting with critical elements in that school environment. We want to be a part of the school safety team. We want to make sure we're connecting with school nurses, with mental health specialists, with school counselors, with school administrators, and others that might be a critical part of a school safety team. You know, I'm asked sometimes by media folks what we think about replacing SROs with school psychologists or mental health specialists. And my immediate answer to that is no, in terms of replacing, but yes, give us more mental health specialists. They're our teammates. So my point is, let's don't pit one teammate against each other. When I was an SRO, had it not been for the mental health specialist in our district, there is no way I would have been successful at this assignment. So again, as an SRO, as a supervisor, however you're approaching this, encourage your SROs to be good teammates. And if they go into a situation where there's not a school safety team, maybe there's an opportunity for the SRO to help develop that school safety team. Next slide, please. Let's talk about the school to prison pipeline just a little bit. Next slide. I'll give you just a little bit of quick history. First time I heard about the school to prison pipeline was in 2010. There was a document that came out in 2011 called Education Under Arrest, and not a well-researched document at all. We responded to that as an association in 2012 with our own report. We spent 9 months on that report. And it's called To Protect and Educate. As a matter of fact, it's a free download from our website at NASRO.org, NASRO.org. And it lays out with data the role of the SRO and the success of SROs, especially those programs where they're carefully selected and specifically trained. There was a Senate hearing in 2012 called Ending the School to Prison Pipeline, which attempted really to throw SROs under the bus completely. Thankfully, there were a lot of sound and solid witnesses at that hearing that were able to dispute some of those allegations against SROs. And then I put Sandy Hook on here because it happened to occur 2 days after that hearing. It was a horrible tragedy, certainly, and changed forever probably the way we look at school safety in the elementary school environment. Next, please. This is our report that I was telling you about, To Protect and Educate, and it again is available at NASRO.org at no cost whatsoever. You do not have to be a member. It's a free download. Next, please. So some facts and data that kind of come out of this report is that all indicators of school crime actually continue on the downward trend. And we're talking about school-associated deaths, violence, non-fatal victimizations, and theft. And again, this occurs during a time that SROs have experienced a lot of growth in our ranks. So it would seem logical to assume that SROs are helping to have some impact on this downward trend of school crime. Next, please. Some other facts and data around this, and I'll start with data between 1994 and 2009. And this data is around the issue of juvenile arrests. And this covers not just school-based arrests, but all juvenile arrests throughout the country. And we see that it fell nearly 50% between 1994 and 2009. We're occasionally accused as SROs of increasing juvenile arrests in a school environment. And as a former SRO and as one who is in contact and in touch with our members, I just don't see that being the case. As a matter of fact, we see a lot of evidence that it's the opposite, that SROs actually help to manage arrests in a school environment and to actually keep them down. And again, you'll see in red there, this period of time coincides with the expansion of SRO programs. Next slide, please. There is some updated data, and looking from 2010 to 2018, the most recent data I have is from the Department of Justice, ending in 2018. And what's really interesting, if you look at the data in that report, there seems to be a spike in juvenile arrests in this country somewhere between 1994 and 1996, and it's very high. But after that period of time, it's like watching a roller coaster come down the other end of the hill. And as a matter of fact, from that period of time between 1994 and 1996 to 2018, juvenile arrests in this country declined by almost 73%. That's significant, folks. And again, same period of time coincides with massive expansion of SRO programs. You think about this period of time coming after Sandy Hook, where there was tremendous expansion. So I'm really proud of where we are in terms of SROs and how they manage arrests in the school environment. Next slide, please. Some school attacks, just so we keep those on our mind. I think we'll all agree that the top 3 school attacks, if we immediately just were asked to name them, would be Columbine in 1999. That's an interesting period of time for me personally. I had just become an SRO, so it forever changed for me, certainly. Sandy Hook in 2012, and then more recently, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting in 2018. Next, please. One of the things we see, though, is that while some will criticize SROs, on the other hand, there are SROs who have had a lot of success in stopping school shootings. This one, as a matter of fact, in Lexington Park, Maryland, came just a little over a month after the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting, where a student opened fire with a handgun and one student was killed and wounded. And we see that a deputy, SRO deputy Blaine Gaskell, responded to the gunfire, and he fired around, striking the shooter as the shooter shot himself and died from the wound. So basically, this shooting was stopped by good, sound SRO tactics and the presence of the SRO. So very important. Next slide. Ocala, Florida, again, about a month after the Maryland shooting, a student opens fire in school prior to a planned student demonstration against gun violence, and one student was wounded in the ankle. The suspect was immediately taken into custody by SRO Jimmy Long. By the way, both of these SROs received NASRO's National Award of Valor following those incidents. Next slide, please. Another significant case in Dixon, Illinois on May 16th, again, just about another month after. A student opens fire on classmates practicing for graduation, and SRO Mark Dallas responds and stops the incident by shooting the assailant. So there is certainly, even though we don't face active shooter incidents very often, thank goodness, there's still plenty of solid evidence here that SROs, again, who are carefully selected and specifically trained in this environment, are capable, very capable of stopping these incidents before there's further loss of life. Next slide, please. Noblesville, Indiana is another example of a school shooting. This particular one on May 25th, a student stepped in to stop the initial shooting, and then the teacher was assisted by the SRO. So again, this is an interesting one where we see a teacher actually taking the first action. Next, please. So student and staff perception of SROs. Again, I think this goes back to the point Jeff was making about the Prince George's County survey, which is a wonderful piece of information for us. This is another important piece of information. This is practical findings from the Virginia School Climate Survey. This was conducted by the University of Virginia. And one of the pieces of this that really interested me was the student response. And I have to tell you, it wound up being in the high 70% range for students who support their SRO, support the SRO program. And it was really an incredible mix from a diversity standpoint in terms of student response to this. So again, I think that we see by and large communities and students in support of good SROs in their schools. Next, please. Memorandums of Understanding and MOU, very important. Again, this goes back to that definition about the collaboration issue, that there has to be good collaboration. and that's just critically important. And a written MOU is a big piece of that. If you don't have a written MOU between your school district and your law enforcement agency, I just want to encourage you to pursue that. NASRO has some samples that we're happy to share with you, but it really is a written document between the district and that law enforcement agency providing the guidelines for the program. I do want to caution to be very careful about how deep you go into the minutia in this MOU. This is intended to lay out general information. So when we start talking about issues around arrests and those kind of things, we want to be very careful in how we handle that. Next slide, please. Some of the things that a good MOU lays out is, for instance, hours on campus. What are the SRO's hours going to be on campus? And it may seem to us from the law enforcement side that, well, it makes sense. They're going to work their shift there. But that can get a little tricky with SRO programs because they can be needed earlier than normal or later than normal. When you talk about what time students are arriving, there are some classes that start really early, and there are some that run really late. And then there are after school events. What is that going to look like? You know, who's going to supply the computer and the office material, the cell phone, all those kind of things. Something that we sometimes think wouldn't really be that big of a deal, but where will the SRO vehicle be parked? It can be a big deal. So we want to make sure we clarify that. Maybe that doesn't have to be in writing, but it's a consideration. Next, please. The location of the SRO office was on the previous one. And I want to make sure that we hone in on that just for a second while the slides are being adjusted. The location of the SRO office really matters in a lot of ways, certainly tactically and strategically, but also it brings about the question of, does the SRO have an office? If they don't, they should. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or huge. It doesn't need to be a place that the SRO is tempted to go sit for 8 hours. If that's happening, then we got to go back to the selection process. But the office is really important. It helps to establish them as a part of that school community. And there have even been some state Supreme Court cases that have ruled in favor of SRO action and had something to say about the SRO having an office and being part of that school community. Next slide, please. Overtime or duties taking place after school or on weekends. This is a big deal. This is a big deal in a lot of ways because if we've got events going on after school that need security, who better to do that than the SRO? It's a great thing, and I've seen it myself, to have the SRO there who's used to interacting with the students, who has that relationship and can help de-escalate and manage things. So we got to look at how that works. Supervision. For traditional SRO programs, I think everyone on this call or on this meeting would agree that the supervision is on the law enforcement side because that's who the officer belongs to inevitably. So, but we also want to understand that when we're working in a school building, that the school principal is in charge of that building. They're ultimately responsible for everything that happens there. So we want to have an attitude of working alongside them and supporting school safety together. And if we establish that relationship on the front end, then there shouldn't be a lot of issues with the supervision piece. Does the SRO monitor or supervise other employees, such as crossing guards, something like that, and media contacts by the SRO? Most agencies probably wouldn't allow that without that going through the public information officer or the chief or sheriff. Next slide. The Triad Concept. We're going to talk about the NASRO or the SRO Triad Concept toward the end of this presentation. And how will interview and arrest procedures be handled? Now, as I said earlier, be a little careful on the arrest issue, but I've seen some situations where outside law enforcement has come in to conduct interviews, and that process hasn't gone really well. So if you've got an SRO program in place, the SRO can be a really good filter for that and can help kind of manage that. And again, if you as an SRO have to arrest a student at school, what is that procedure going to look like? We want it to have the least possible impact on the school. It's already a bad day that we're having to do this. How do we minimize that impact? Next. the SRO's role or lack of it in formal school discipline. And let me just be clear, the NASRO is very clear in our training that SROs should not be involved in formal school discipline. Suspensions, expulsions, in-school suspension, that process belongs to the school administration. Just like arrests belongs to law enforcement from a responsibility standpoint. Next, please. Information sharing, there is some good information out of the U.S. Department of Education around FERPA as it applies to SROs. I would encourage you to go to the U.S. Department of Education website and locate that document on FERPA as it relates to SROs. Very important to take a look at that. Next, please. Additional considerations, go ahead. Uniforms, absolutely. We see a lot of talk about whether SROs should wear uniforms or not. I'm going to be very clear about that. I'm not sure that I understand the idea of utilizing an SRO in a school environment that's not uniformed. So where the debate and conversation comes into play within law enforcement sometimes is, do we wear a Class A uniform or is it a soft uniform? What kind of uniform? But we firmly believe, and it's in our standards and best practices, that uniformed SROs are important. Weapons, and our response to that is the SRO should be equipped in the same manner as the other officers within the department, and of course they should be well trained. Same thing with the less lethal tools. They should be equipped with the same things and well trained. Next, please. So let's go back to the issue for a minute. You can go, there you go. All right. The issue of being properly selected. What does that look like? What are we talking about here? And I think that most of us get it, if we've been around this any length of time. We're certainly looking for officers who truly like kids, students, and really have a desire to work with them. Otherwise, we don't need them in this assignment. That would be like putting someone on the bomb squad who had no interest in working with bombs or diffusing devices. So it's very important that we're looking for that in the proper selection. They also need to possess people skills, and they need to be calm and approachable. We tell SROs in our basic course that you need to be the calmest person in a situation that occurs, in a crisis situation. And so they really do need to have that skill set. Law enforcement experience, we recommend that the officer be with your department for a minimum of 3 years. Part of that is just the fact that you know them a little bit better. You know their work history, you know their discipline history, you know if they've been engaged in volunteer activities with, youth coaching, those kind of things. So it's a little tricky if you try to put a new officer in because you don't know exactly what you're getting. This is going to become the most well-known officer or deputy in your department, or among the most well-known, depending on how many SROs you have. And there's just no way of getting around that. And that's going to be either for good or bad. So it's a bit of a burden, not only on the officer, but on the supervisor for making the selection. And again, that high standards of morals and integrity, incredibly important. Next slide. Properly trained. Listen, the bottom line is without proper training, SROs can make serious mistakes. We've all seen it. And they are mistakes that can cause short-term difficulties and at worst jeopardize the entire SRO program. I mean, let's face it, folks, we've got SRO programs in some areas being removed where they are specifically trained, where they are doing a good job. So we sure don't need to increase the load of low-hanging fruit and present further opportunities for discussions around SROs not being in schools. We've already seen the benefits and some of the things we've laid out on the front end of this presentation. Next, please. Now we'll get into the Triad Concept, something that some of you may be familiar with, maybe all of you are, but it's always important to revisit the Triad Concept. And I will tell you this, as simple as the images that you're looking at, it actually forms the basis for really everything that we do, from advocacy, from membership services, and certainly in training. And so I'll quickly lay out the components of that for you. Next slide, please. At the foundation, of course, is the role as a law enforcement officer, which, let's face it, if that role were not in place, then the schools wouldn't necessarily need us. They would maybe be looking to hire another counselor or another teacher or whatever it is their need may be. But the law enforcement piece of this is at such a foundation of this triad concept that we cannot forget about it. But we've certainly got to learn how to function in that law enforcement role in the school environment. I've talked about arrests. Good SROs are really able to approach arrests in a different manner on a school campus than they are out on the street. And I like to use the crime of disorderly conduct to describe this. Out on the street, we may not have any other resources. We may not have any other choice but to make an arrest for disorderly conduct. In the school environment, we have so many more resources around us. If we use them wisely, they may actually be able to do something more effective with the student than us having to make a disorderly conduct arrest. Now, don't get me wrong, there are certainly times when arrest becomes necessary. And again, that means we've had a bad day. But there are many instances in a school environment where we can avoid that in a good way if we have other resources to deal with that issue. So again, just an example of how the law enforcement piece looks a little different in a school environment. Next slide, please. Teacher, I'd like to really say educator. And what we train the SRO to do is to get comfortable with getting into the classroom, even if it's for 5 minutes, to present on a topic around law-related education in a role as a guest speaker. There's so much that an officer, an SRO now, can provide in the school, in that classroom environment from an experience standpoint. If you think about an officer who's maybe had a lot of experience at traffic accident investigation, well, that fits nicely in a math class for 5 or 10 minutes. And you're also, whether you mean to or not, doing a little bit of recruiting by doing something like that. Just the issue of maybe addressing with new drivers, juniors and seniors in high school, how they're supposed to react if they're pulled over by law enforcement. What's their role? What are they supposed to do? And so it can become really important opportunities, not just to provide education to the students, but to also build relationships. I will say, as an SRO, some of the best relationships I feel like I ever built were in that classroom environment. Next slide, please. The third side of this triad is the role of informal counselor, really. I like to kind of put the word informal in front of there. We're not trained counselors. We're not counselors in terms of what a school counselor is supposed to do, and we don't need to pretend to do that at all. But informal counseling, again, when we go back to that experience issue that we should be looking at and the selection process, officers on the street do a lot of informal counseling. Think about the times that you made a vehicle stop, that you didn't write a citation, but you did some really good informal counseling. Or the domestic dispute incident between two neighbors where there was no assault, but you did a lot of really good informal counseling and no arrest was necessary, and it helped de-escalate the situation. So these are just some ideas around the triad concept. There's so much more to it, but I kind of wanted to give you some general ideas on that. Next slide, please. One of the things that we really want to focus on with SROs, again, is this issue of de-escalation. And if you think about de-escalation, that there's probably not a 5-step process. It really is a little bit more of a philosophy. I remember myself, I was just talking about domestic disputes when I was a rookie patrol officer back in 1986. I remember a sergeant talking to me about this very issue, and I don't think he ever used the word de-escalation. It was more talking about how to calm people in a little bit of a crisis situation. And he related it to a domestic dispute and really talked to me through how to do that. And so sure enough, my next domestic dispute, I remember it like it was yesterday. I went in and this guy, his face is blood red. He's so mad. And I did exactly what the sergeant had encouraged me. I walked over to him and I introduced myself. and it was like the color began to come back in his head a little bit. And he said, "I'm sorry, I'm so upset." And I thought, hey, this works. Now, as I like to explain, especially in an in-person training, it's maybe a little like pepper spray. It's not going to work on everybody every time, but de-escalation is an incredibly valuable tool and philosophy to have in your tool belt. So it really resolves a crisis through problem solving rather than by force, and helps to reestablish equilibrium faster. And every time I utilize this slide in training, I think about that particular domestic dispute call during my rookie season. Next slide, please. So problem solving, not force. Can we use force? Absolutely. We're trained to use force. It's a part of the nature of who we are. I again remember back to my days as a rookie when someone said, "You know, this is a really different job. We wear a gun to work instead of a pen in our pocket." That's so true. So we can certainly use force, but problem solving, man, I learned quickly. That's the way to go if I can. If I don't have to take someone to jail, if we can get past that and get things calmed down and solve the problem, that's a win. So when we're talking about students, we want to get their attention. Certainly want to get their attention. And if you've got the relationships built, that's a lot easier to do. Again, not easy every time, but it's still a lot easier to do to get their attention just with your voice, just with your presence. And we want to gain their cooperation. What is it that the student, what is it that the youth really wants? What is it they're really looking for? What are they really reacting to? Is it disrespect versus mental health? Is it disorder versus trauma? So let's think about this in terms of problem solving more so, much more so than force. Next slide, please. What you can do, first of all, as an adult and as an SRO, be aware of your own feelings. Some youth just want to push others' buttons and get them to react emotionally. And folks, if you have ever sat through one of our basic courses, one of the key blocks in that course is understanding the adolescent brain. And this is a part of adolescent brain development. Some youths just, are in that place of being pretty good at pushing other people's buttons. Don't let it happen to you. You've got this big frontal lobe that you can think with, and we should be able to rationalize through some of these things. I'm not suggesting that we wouldn't become upset or emotional, but we certainly have the ability to control those emotions more than a youth dealing with an adolescent brain. And then be aware of your own posture, voice, and tone. As I like to say, we always want to be one level below, at least one level below wherever the youth is in terms of their emotions, in terms of their reaction, in terms of their voice and tone. And this doesn't apply just to students, but you're going to have interactions as an SRO where you're dealing with adults that are upset. So these are the things we can do. Be aware of our own feelings, watch our own posture, voice, and tone. Next slide, please. And then tips for communicating with youth. Use simple, age-appropriate language. And we have to be intentional about that sometimes. So make sure we're using age-appropriate language. Address youth at eye level. One of the ways that I found is really successful in some instances in de-escalating someone, especially a youth, is if they're seated, sit down. If it's tactically sound, sit down so you can be at eye level with them. If they're standing, stand up. Be at eye level. Explain your role. You're there to help. You're there to problem solve. And they need to understand that. We're not here right now to make an arrest. We're here to problem solve. Don't make promises you can't keep. You will lose credibility big time. And then remove upsetting influences from the scene. If we think about a situation where we're engaged with a youth and dealing with a youth that's upset, and there are 30 other classmates around, we're going to de-escalate some of that by removing the other classmates from the situation, right? You may need some staff help with that, some administrative help. But there are a lot of ways we can de-escalate more through our actions than what we say. Next slide. Here is my contact information, my email address, and my phone number. Feel free to reach out to me. I really appreciate this opportunity and being given the time for this session. Thank you so much.
Bo, thank you very much for that fantastic information. And we do have a couple of questions, but before we get to them, would like to expand on something you were talking about. You gave us some case examples of where SROs were able to step in quickly to a critical incident and mitigate the loss of life or injury. I would encourage everybody on the webinar today, go to the COPS office website. That's the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Community Oriented Policing Services. But go to their website. They've actually got a report there on averted school violence specific to SROs. And yes, there have been many cases where SROs have stepped in the middle of a critical incident. There's been even more where the critical incident was prevented in the first place because students trusted their SRO. Went to the SRO with critical information mode, like you were talking about, developing the relationships to get that information. So I really do commend that report. It's averted school violence, special report, school resource officers. That's the title of it. It's on the COPS office website. There's about 15 or 16 cases in there. If you're responsible for doing community violence prevention training, great report to go to. If you're developing tabletop exercises for your school safety team, go there, get real life cases that you can use. So Mo, just a couple of questions here real quick as we wrap up. I know there's been some research recently actually indicated that SRO actions are largely dictated by the role prescribed for them by the school and their law enforcement agency. Has that been your experience also?
Yeah, Jeff, I think that I would agree with that. And I think, again, that goes back to the critical role of collaboration. There has to be proper collaboration between the school district and the law enforcement agency from the top down, whether it's the sheriff and the superintendent, the police chief and the superintendent. That has to be solid from the top down. And that's just so critically important. And then once that happens, we don't wind up finding ourselves in a tug of war between, well, the school wants me to do this, but the law enforcement agency wants me to do this. Very, very important.
Good, thank you. Yeah, in looking into that research, it actually suggests that where the agreement between the school and the law enforcement agency is that the police officer, the school resource officer, is going to spend more of their time in that informal counselor role, that actually what you end up finding is SROs using non-judicial interventions more and more as opposed to arrest to solve problems. So, and again, it's an upfront agreed upon role between the school and the law enforcement agency.
Hey, Jeff, if I could just elaborate one more thing on that. And
Yeah.
I think, that this is where the triad is so critically important. I know as an SRO, I didn't arrest very many students. I didn't have to. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way at all. It just because I was taught how to do the job, that helped me learn about the other resources around me and to be able to use informal counseling and education as a piece of that too.
Fantastic, Mo. Thank you. Mo, I've heard you talk, just staying on this for one more second, I have heard you talk about when you poll your members about how many arrests they made in the last school year. What does that look like?
Jeff, it was really interesting last year. As much as I pushed back at having to do a virtual conference, folks who know me know that I like to train in person. I think we all do. But we found a lot of value in that virtual conference last year. We had several hundred folks join us for the conference. And one of the neat things was an ongoing chat box where they could engage with each other. So we were like, hey, let's start throwing some surveys out there. And we did one on school-based arrests, and we applied it to the previous school year, 2018-19, which was a little more normal, of course. And what we found was over 50% of the respondents said they arrested 0 students. And I think the highest we saw on any of them was 5 students in a school year. So it really just in that little informal poll, and it's a question that I ask our members all the time. when I'm engaged with them. So, and it stays right about 0 to 5.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful to get that perspective. Mo, just one other question. I think that one of the takeaways that you're offering us is the critical importance of having a school safety team so that SRO is not the Lone Ranger. It's not expected to be the Lone Ranger. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Oh, let me just say this first of all. If you think as an SRO, or if you as a chief or sheriff think that your SRO is going to come in and save the day in terms of school safety, that's wrong-headed thinking. Okay, that this has to be a cooperative effort. I really don't like it when someone asks me about our role as armed guards. We're not armed guards. SROs are not armed guards. You're not positioned at a doorway. You shouldn't be for 8 hours of a school day waiting for a threat that will likely never come through those doors. You have to be engaged, and part of that is being engaged with those school safety team members. Again, I'll say, if you walk into a situation where there's not a school safety team, don't be a bull in a china shop, but begin to lay a foundation for helping to build a school safety team and be a part of that. You want colleagues in that building who you can consider teammates. And once you show you're a good teammate, they will accept you in the same way.
That's great. Thank you, Mo. I know a lot of us are pretty zoomed out, so it's especially gratifying to see so many of our colleagues joining us today. I just want to thank you again for that. Thanks, Mo Canady, for sharing your time and insights with us. And finally, want to say thank you to Christy Barksdale and the staff of the National Sheriff's Association for their awesome coordination of this event, and of course, to the COPS office for making it possible. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Christy.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you so much for your time today. A huge thank you to Mo and, of course, the COPS office for all making this webinar possible. And thank you to our participants today for joining. My contact information is listed on this slide, so please contact me with any questions. And please join us for our next webinar in the series titled Behavior Threat Assessment and Management. That will be presented by Dr. Lena Alatheria on April 20th at 2 p.m. Thank you again for joining, and have a nice day.